I wasn't afraid to live. That's what makes this confession difficult. I wasn't paralyzed by fear. I wasn't hiding under excuses. I wasn't running from responsibility. I was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. The right conditions. The right version of myself. I believed that life, when done correctly, required timing. You don't jump too early. You don't move before you're ready. You don't choose until you're certain. That belief shaped everything. At first, it felt intelligent. Controlled. Adult. I watched other people rush into decisions and struggle. Fail. Regret. I told myself I was wiser. I would move when it made sense. So I waited. I waited when an opportunity appeared but felt incomplete. I waited when a feeling surfaced but wasn't fully formed. I waited when my intuition spoke softly instead of screaming. Waiting felt safe. Nothing bad happened while I waited. And that's how it fooled me. From the outside, my life looked calm. Deliberate. Thoughtful. I wasn't stagnant, I was preparing. Or so I told myself. Years passed like that. Quietly. I became very good at evaluating possibilities. At weighing risks. At imagining outcomes. I lived more in scenarios than in moments. Whenever something called for action, I asked myself the same question: is this the right time? The answer was almost always no. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't perfect. There was always something missing. More clarity. More confidence. More stability. I told myself patience was a virtue. I didn't realize patience can become avoidance when it has no deadline. I wasn't unhappy. That's important. I was comfortable enough not to panic. Functional enough not to collapse. Engaged enough to look present. But something subtle was happening. Time started to feel strange. Days passed normally, but years felt compressed. I could recall events, birthdays, changes, transitions, but I couldn't remember myself inside them. I had been present for everything, except decision. I noticed how often I described my life in conditional language. I could do this someday. I might change later. When things settle, I'll start. My life existed in the future tense. The present was just a holding area. I remember a moment that should have alarmed me more than it did. Someone asked me what I wanted next. Not eventually. Not theoretically. Next. I paused longer than I should have. Not because I had too many options. Because I had none that felt immediate. Everything meaningful was postponed. That realization left a strange taste in my mouth. I brushed it off. I told myself it meant I was flexible. Open. Not boxed in. But flexibility without direction is just drift. I didn't drift wildly. I drifted politely. I stayed where I was acceptable. Where expectations were manageable. Where nothing demanded urgency. Waiting became my default response to life. And waiting, I believed, was harmless. I didn't see it as a choice. I saw it as restraint. I didn't understand that restraint still shapes outcomes. Life doesn't pause while you prepare. It continues, quietly deciding for you. Opportunities didn't disappear dramatically. They expired. Feelings didn't explode. They faded. Possibilities didn't reject me. They moved on. I told myself I hadn't lost anything important. I was wrong. I just hadn't noticed yet. The most dangerous part of waiting is that it doesn't hurt immediately. It lulls you into thinking you have time. I remember standing alone one evening, looking at nothing in particular, when a thought crossed my mind without warning: how long have I been getting ready? That question unsettled me. Because I couldn't answer it. I realized I had built my identity around potential. Around the idea that I was still becoming. But becoming requires motion. I had mistaken delay for depth. Preparation for progress. Waiting for wisdom. And slowly, without noticing, I had let life happen around me while I stayed on standby. I wasn't afraid of the wrong life. I was afraid of choosing a life. Because choosing meant closing doors. Accepting limits. Living with consequences. Waiting let me avoid all of that. Or so I thought. Standing there, in that quiet moment, I felt something unfamiliar. Not panic. Not sadness. Urgency. A realization sharp enough to cut through years of calm. I wasn't waiting for the right moment anymore. I was running out of moments. Once the urgency appeared, it didn't leave. It sat with me in quiet moments. In pauses between tasks. In the silence after conversations ended. I tried to reason with it. You're just anxious. You're overthinking. Nothing is actually wrong. But this wasn't anxiety. Anxiety is loud. This was precise. It pointed to patterns I could no longer ignore. I started seeing my life as a series of almosts. Almost changed direction. Almost said yes. Almost walked away. Almost began. Each almost felt insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a life lived in rehearsal. I began replaying moments I had dismissed as not the right time. Conversations where I felt something shift inside me, and chose silence. Opportunities that stirred excitement, and I asked for more time. Decisions that felt intuitively right, and I postponed them until they went cold. At the time, each delay felt responsible. Now, they felt deliberate. I realized I had built a sophisticated defense system around waiting. Waiting protected me from embarrassment. From regret. From having to own outcomes that might not match my expectations. But it also protected me from momentum. Nothing moved unless it was forced. And nothing forced me. I wasn't being held back. I was holding myself in place. That realization hurt. Because it meant the cost of waiting wasn't accidental. It was chosen. I started noticing how often I framed my life in terms of readiness. I need to be more prepared. I need to understand this better. I need to feel more certain. Certainty became my imaginary requirement. But certainty never arrived. Because certainty doesn't precede life. It follows it. I had reversed the order. I believed insight came before action. That clarity was a prerequisite for movement. In reality, movement creates clarity. Waiting had taught me the opposite. It taught me to mistrust my instincts. To overanalyze impulses until they dissolved. To treat hesitation as wisdom. I had become incredibly good at explaining why now wasn't the moment. That skill impressed people. It impressed me too. Until I saw the cost. I noticed how emotionally flat I had become. Not unhappy. Not numb. Just uninvested. Nothing felt urgent enough to deserve full attention. Life became something I managed instead of participated in. I felt like an observer of my own timeline. And then came the thought I couldn't shake. What if this is not preparation? What if this is avoidance disguised as intelligence? That question reframed everything. I looked at my life not as something unfinished, but as something ongoing. The realization was brutal. There was no hidden version of my life forming in the background. No future moment where everything would click into place and begin. This was it. And I had been postponing my presence inside it. The moral dilemma surfaced slowly. If I stopped waiting, I would have to accept imperfection. Make choices without guarantees. Risk regret openly instead of hypothetically. If I continued waiting, I would remain safe, but only by sacrificing momentum entirely. Both paths had consequences. Only one involved movement. I realized something deeply uncomfortable. I wasn't afraid of choosing wrong. I was afraid of discovering that even my best choice wouldn't feel perfect. Waiting allowed me to preserve the fantasy of the perfect life. Choosing would replace it with a real one. Real lives are messy. Imprecise. Uncertain. Waiting kept everything clean. It also kept everything hypothetical. I started feeling resentment, not toward anyone else, but toward time itself. Years had passed, and I couldn't point to moments where I had truly entered my life. I had been hovering above it, evaluating. At some point, evaluation becomes refusal. That line had been crossed long ago. I understood then why the urgency felt sharp. It wasn't panic. It was grief, arriving early. Grief for a life that was slipping past without resistance. Grief for the version of myself that believed preparation was progress. I couldn't unsee it anymore. Waiting was no longer neutral. It was an active choice to remain untouched. And untouched things don't grow. They expire. That realization changed the question. Not, when is the right moment? But, how many moments have I already let go? I didn't suddenly become decisive. That's the myth people like to tell, that one day clarity arrives and everything falls into place. What actually happened was quieter. I got tired of standing still. Not tired in the dramatic sense. Not burned out. Not broken. Just deeply, irrevocably exhausted by preparation. Exhausted by the constant evaluation of my own life as if it were a draft that needed more edits before publication. The moment I stopped waiting wasn't heroic. It was almost disappointing. I realized there would be no signal. No internal certainty strong enough to silence doubt. No version of me that felt ready. Readiness was a story I told myself to justify delay. So I did something unfamiliar. I chose without certainty. I made a decision knowing it might be imperfect. Knowing it might lead somewhere I didn't fully understand yet. Knowing I might regret parts of it. That terrified me. But something else happened alongside the fear. Relief. Not relief that everything would work out, relief that I was finally moving. For the first time in years, time felt heavy again. Not oppressive, meaningful. Each day carried consequence. Each choice left a mark. Waiting had insulated me from consequence. Action reintroduced it. And with consequence came ownership. I noticed how different my thoughts sounded when I was no longer postponing my life. They were messier. Less elegant. More urgent. But they were real. I stopped asking, is this the right moment? And started asking, is this a moment I'm willing to live through? That shift changed everything. Some choices didn't feel right immediately. Some days felt harder than the calm, controlled waiting I had known. There were moments I missed the safety of indecision. Waiting had been painless in a way. It required nothing from me. Choosing demanded everything. There were losses. Opportunities that no longer existed because I didn't choose them earlier. Paths that had closed quietly while I was preparing. Versions of myself that would never be explored. I had to grieve that. Not dramatically. Honestly. I stopped pretending I hadn't missed anything. I had. Waiting costs. It costs time you don't notice leaving. It costs chances that don't announce their expiration. It costs the version of you that only exists when you act early. Accepting that hurt. But it also grounded me. Because regret acknowledged is better than regret postponed. As I moved forward, imperfectly, uncertainly, I began to notice something unexpected. I felt alive in moments that would have terrified me before. Not confident. Engaged. I was no longer evaluating my life from a distance. I was inside it. I stopped needing my choices to justify themselves intellectually before I lived them. I let experience teach me instead. Some choices worked. Some didn't. But all of them belonged to me. That was new. I learned something crucial in the aftermath of waiting. There is no such thing as the right moment. There is only the moment you enter, and the ones you let pass while preparing. Waiting doesn't protect you from mistakes. It only ensures you make fewer memories. I still feel doubt. I still question myself. But now those questions happen in motion, not in stasis. They shape direction instead of preventing it. If you're listening to this and you feel like you've been preparing for your life instead of living it, I want you to understand something clearly. Preparation is only valuable if it leads to action. Otherwise, it's just a sophisticated way of avoiding risk. The right moment is not something you recognize. It's something you create by showing up, unready, uncertain, imperfect. I didn't miss my life because I chose wrong. I almost missed it because I waited to choose it all. And the moment I accepted that no amount of readiness would replace courage, no amount of thinking would replace living, no amount of patience would replace presence, my life didn't suddenly make sense. But it finally started happening. Not somewhere else. Not later. Here. Now. And for the first time, that was enough.